Hi guys, this is Cycle 1, Week 17 Art, and in Community this week you are going to get to continue teaching your students about great artists from the Renaissance time period. You're going to be introducing them to a new artist, and that is Michelangelo. He is probably the most famous artist that we're studying from Cycle 1, arguably one of the most famous artists in the history of art. He is an Italian painter, sculptor, poet. He wrote autobiographies, he did architecture. If you want, it was suggested in the video from the last time we did Cycle 1 that you could expound on the definition of what a Renaissance man is with your older students, because Michelangelo really fits that description well. He was not limited in what he could produce. He had a really prolific career. He was just so gifted, and at that time of history, men were encouraged to pursue all different areas of study and become proficient in all of them. There was a man by the name of Alberti who said, a man can do all things if he will. And so really just not being put into a box, but being able to pursue so many different things. And Michelangelo, he did that, and with great success. So you could do that with your students if you want to talk about what is a Renaissance man, because that's a term that we still use to this day. Or you could just help your students identify that this is an artist from the Renaissance time period. He is more from the High Renaissance rather than the early Renaissance, which the artists we've studied so far were more in that early time period. As far as his name is concerned, I'm guilty of this myself. I think very often you hear it pronounced Michelangelo. It is, if we're sticking to the Italian pronunciation, it would be Michelangelo. His last name was Buonarroti. You don't have to say his last name though, because he is pretty much remembered mononymously as Michelangelo. There is a scene, if you're a fan of the Lego movie, or maybe you watched it with your kids, where Vitruvius is on Cloud Cuckoo Land and he's introducing a whole bunch of master builders, and in fast succession he says Michelangelo, and you see the Ninja Turtle and he says Michelangelo, and it's a little sculptor. That might be helpful to just differentiate between the two. Maybe some of your older students will even be familiar with that movie, but that is how I'm going to try to pronounce his name throughout this video, and if you're able to do it in class, then that would be great. I don't think it's a game changer though. You may accidentally go back to Michelangelo, and your kids will know who you're talking about. So at the end of the day, most importantly, we want to help them just identify what works he created and what he's remembered for. And so what we're going to be talking about primarily is his most famous works. He would have considered himself mostly a sculptor, but I think history remembers his work in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel even more than his sculpting. There's the David, and if you look in your orange folders, I believe there is an example. You can see a close-up of his hand, and then there's, I believe, an upper body portion that shows the David. That's his most famous sculpture, probably. Otherwise, you can show your students the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and that's a fresco. And so you can help define that for your students. That's what we're going to be talking about in community this week. We won't be duplicating our own fresco, but we are going to be starting with a dry medium and then adding water to it. So it's kind of a reverse, because in fresco art, fresco in Italian actually means fresh, and so it would have been, artists would take a fresh layer of plaster, and while it was still wet, they'd be painting on it. It was a buon fresco, and so that's what he did in the ceiling. And I also feel like it's helpful to note, because I was taught incorrectly too, didn't even learn it until recent years, that Michelangelo did not paint lying on his back the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He actually would have been standing on extensive scaffolding, and so imagine how he would have been craning his neck upward the entire time and having his hand in the air and trying to paint this vast fresco. And it took him 4 years to do that, and it caused him such physical pain that he ended up writing poetry about it. And in the meantime, if you want to look that up for fun and read an English translation of it, it's really colorful. He was in a great deal of pain and anguish and questioned whether his work was even worth it, but was asking his friend to just defend it anyways, regardless of his extreme pain that it took him to complete it. So that's kind of an interesting thing, a side note, but we will be doing an activity that looks more like this. I'll get to that in a moment, but we're going to be doing our best to make it in the style of what Michelangelo would have done. So if you hit those main points with your students, that gives them some sufficient background on who Michelangelo was, what he did, and then you'll want to make sure before you get to class on Tuesday that in your Ziploc bags you have enough of these for all of your students. There's different characters that they can choose from, or if you want to avoid any arguing, you can just distribute those, whatever is easiest for you. And then they're going to begin by using watercolor pencils, so make sure that you have those in your bag too. You'll be sharing with your partner class, but there should be enough for you to divide up between all your students. And then you're also going to want to have tape, and you're going to want to have a disposable tablecloth, mainly to catch any water that drips while we're working on this, but then at the end for drying you can put those on a table or on the disposable tablecloth on the floor. So you'll begin, this one doesn't have a lot of setup, so that's kind of nice. You can have a mom help pass papers out, but this isn't something where you need to have it ready to go before we begin school on Tuesday. So yeah, show your students the different examples of Michelangelo's artwork in your orange folder. Then you can segue into handing these out. Explain to your students what a fresco is, what it means, and then you can tell them that what we're going to be doing is using watercolored pencils to color in our artwork of some famous figures, and then we're going to be using paintbrushes and water to turn it into more like a watercolor art. So again, like I said earlier, it's like a reverse fresco. And I am aware that the tables in our classrooms are not really, they're not great for taping underneath, and that might even just perpetuate this falsehood that he painted while lying on his back anyways. And so what we're going to do is, after your students have colored in as much of this as they can, it turns out better, the brighter it is, the more colors they use, so encourage them to color in as much as possible. But what I would say you could do, rather than using the underside of a table, is to go to a wall in your classroom, or if you need to even use a hallway wall, you could do that too, and get your disposable tablecloth, lie down on the floor to catch any water drips, and then have them tape it as high as they can so that it is above their head. It's not going to be at eye level, but actually forces them to have to paint in a more awkward position. And so maybe something kind of like that. And the way this stuff works is when you add water, it just turns it more into watercolor art, which is kind of fun. I hope your students enjoy seeing how that changes the color and just the look of what they created. And this isn't going to take them very long to complete, but you can remind them that Michelangelo, it took him 4 years to finish the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and he would have been in an even more painful position. And so maybe that's one big takeaway for them if they think about Michelangelo years down the road. What is he famous for? He had to do a really hard project. Something else interesting that I read about him was that he kind of did have a tendency to abandon some of his projects halfway through. He would get frustrated easily. And there's a teachable moment in that too. Like, you can pause a project and come back to it later, but it's disappointing when you never come back to it at all. And so we can learn from that as well. It's good to just take a step back. A lot of artists would do that, where they would start a project and then they wouldn't return to it for a while, but then they finally did, and we're grateful to have those now. So it's okay to think and process and not have to do everything all at once. But as you can see, I'm going to take this back down. It will drip. That's okay too. You can have some paper towels handy maybe, so that if kids want to dab at their artwork while they're working on it, they can. Here's another example of how one of those might turn out. This one my son did, and he did the whole background first in the watercolor colored pencils, and so that again really just allows the finished product to pop a bit more. So encourage them to do that, and then let them dry, get their names put on the back of the paper. so that we can identify them when they're done. And that is the activity for this week. I hope you guys have fun learning about Michelangelo. Please let me know if anything is missing from your Ziploc bag, and I can get extras of it and bring it with to community on Tuesday. Thanks, guys.